Hello there, welcome back to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Vichadello.
This week, all the fun of the fair. Presidential hopefuls descend on Midwestern Iowa 5 months before the voting begins.
And another week, another criminal indictment for Donald Trump and a special counsel appointed to probe Hunter Biden's business affairs and everything else. But first...
And heading the news from Planet America.
News on former President Trump. He's been indicted for the 4th time in 5 months.
A Georgia grand jury handing up 41 charges against Trump and nearly 24 of his allies, accusing them of trying to overturn the 2020 election loss.
The district attorney in Fulton County, Georgia, Fani Willis, an elected Democrat, announced details of the latest indictments just before midnight on Monday local time, following a 2-year investigation.
Based on information developed by that investigation, a Fulton County grand jury returned a true bill of indictment, charging 19 individuals with violations of Georgia law arising from a criminal conspiracy to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election in this state.
The indictment includes 41 felony counts and is 97 pages long. The first under indictment,
Donald John Trump.
And number 2,
Rudolph William Louis Giuliani.
Warrants have been issued for the arrest of Trump, Giuliani and 17 others. They have until next Friday to voluntarily surrender to police. Willis is alleging a far-reaching criminal conspiracy summed up by this now infamous phone call between Trump and Georgia's Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger.
I just want to find 11,780 votes.
Republicans are still mostly standing by Trump, including Texas Senator Ted Cruz.
I tell you what I really think of Donald Trump. This man is a pathological liar. He doesn't know the difference between truth and lies. He lies practically every word that comes out of his mouth.
Oh, sorry, that's the wrong clip.
This is disgraceful. Our country is over 200 years old. We have never once indicted a former president or a candidate and a leading candidate for president. And this is Joe Biden and this is the Democrats weaponizing the justice system because they're afraid of the voters. This is disgraceful. It is wrong, and it is an abuse of power by angry Democrats who have decided the rule of law doesn't matter to them anymore.
What a difference 5 years and a beard can make. But Ted can rest easy because Trump says that he's about to blow the whole case out of the water with
a large, complex, detailed but irrefutable report.
Which proves the election was stolen, and he plans to release it next Monday. And then, Trump says,
all charges should be dropped against me and others. There will be a complete exoneration.
To which Georgia's Republican Governor Brian Kemp responded, the 2020 election in Georgia was not stolen. For nearly 3 years now, anyone with evidence of fraud has failed to come forward under oath and prove anything in a court of law.
What's interesting about Trump's reaction for me is that he's had the same complaint now for every single indictment so far, including this one.
Why did they indict 2.5 years ago? Witch hunt.
Well, in the case of Fani Willis, she initiated this criminal investigation back in February 2021, only a month after January 6 and mere weeks after she took office. Sometimes the wheel of justice spins kind of slowly, but I'll tell you what can be done very quickly. Gathering evidence of a stolen election. You can do that pronto. So why has it taken Trump 2.5 years to get his Acme report together? And why is Georgia literally having to sue the people who came up with many of these claims to get them to respect Georgia's subpoenas for any evidence that they might have? That's strange, isn't it? I would have thought they'd hand over the evidence. By the way, I know Trump's just making a political defence here, yes. It's not a legal defence. But for those at home, even if Trump could prove the election was stolen, it's too late now. It wouldn't really influence these charges at all. What it might do, though, is open Trump up to more charges. As Trump's old lawyer, Ty Cobb, said.
Frankly, there's a good chance that whatever document he produces ends up as evidence against him. It could even end up, as the basis for an obstruction count against the author, because it's likely to be fiction, and solely for the purpose of contaminating the jury pool.
Although admittedly there are worse ways that Trump could react, like for instance, say, making a TV ad like this.
And Biden's newest lackey, Atlanta DA, Fani Willis. So incompetent, on her watch, violent crimes have exploded. So tainted, Willis was thrown off one case for trying to prosecute a political opponent. So corrupt, Willis got caught hiding a relationship with a gang member she was prosecuting. So dishonest, Willis was accused of creating a fake subpoena. Welcome to the fraud squad.
Needless to say, every single word there was garbage. None of that is true. But leaving all that aside, what the hell? It's like he wants to go to jail for contempt. What is that?
Or maybe he is listening to his old attorney, Ty Cobb, because the latest we're hearing is that maybe that report is not going to be released in a press conference on Monday after all. We will see. But as luck would have it, the person that Donald Trump defeated for the presidency back in 2016, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, she was booked to appear on the Rachel Maddow show on MSNBC on Monday night, just as news of these impending indictments were announced.
Madam Secretary, fancy meeting you here.
Oh, I
It's really
can't
nice to have you
believe
here.
this.
Yeah, this is not the circumstances in which I expected to be talking to you.
Nor me, Rachel. It's always good to talk to you, but honestly, I didn't think that it would be under these circumstances. Yet another set of indictments.
Now, some Trump loyalists like Kayleigh McEnany took particular exception to what they saw as Hillary Clinton gloating.
So gross to see her laughing, positively giddy. I watched CNN after the third indictment. I flipped it on briefly, laughing, cackling about this. Like, is this good for America, guys, to indict a former president?
So gross. But in fact, Hillary Clinton was laughing at the coincidence, the timing of her being on air as Trump's indictments were announced. She actually took a very, very serious tone.
Well, it's hard to believe. I don't feel any satisfaction. I feel great, just great, profound sadness that we have a former president who has been indicted for so many charges that went right to the heart of whether or not our democracy would survive.
So many charges. And for those keeping score, former President Donald Trump, who remains, of course, the overwhelming favourite to be the Republican Party's presidential nominee next year, is now facing a total of 91 criminal indictments. The first, falsifying business records in that Stormy Daniels hush money case, 34 counts. And in the classified documents case, Trump is charged with 32 counts of willfully retaining national defence information and another 8 for concealing, destroying or making false statements about those documents. 2 weeks ago, of course, in that January 6th case, he was charged with conspiring to defraud the United States, violating civil rights and obstruction of an official proceeding. And now comes Georgia. 13 counts, starting with racketeering, a charge under the old RICO Act, which, if you remember your TV shows from the 70s, it's usually reserved for mobsters. Well, unlike the federal indictments, though, brought by Special Counsel Jack Smith in the documents in January 6 cases, this state case in Georgia cannot be shut down by a hypothetically re-elected Donald Trump or whoever he might appoint his Attorney General. He's also unable to potentially self-pardon, and under Georgia state law, not even Governor Brian Kemp could simply pardon Trump, even if he wanted to. There is a 5-member pardon and parole board in the state which has to do that, and that may not be much help to Donald Trump either, because they can only issue a pardon when the criminal has 1, completed their sentence, 2, has no pending charges, that'll be a while, and then they have to wait another 5 years on top of all of that. That, of course, Chaz, is unless the Georgia Republican Party, which dominates the State House, want to change the law entirely relating to their pardon system, which frankly can't be ruled out at this point.
They do have some interesting laws, John. I'm going to talk about a couple of them in a second. But first of all, I should explain what racketeering actually means, at least in Georgia, because they have a particularly stringent racketeering law there. It's similar to a kind of conspiracy where prosecutors have to prove the existence of a criminal enterprise and a pattern of racketeering activity. Okay, so what's an enterprise? It's a group of people with a common purpose or goal. What's the goal in this case? It's to unlawfully change the outcome of the election in favour of Trump, according to the indictment. Right out the gate, on the first page of the evidence in the indictment, Willis shows Trump's intent. She notes that on election night, Trump made a nationally televised speech falsely declaring victory, but importantly, Trump discussed a draft of that speech, falsely claiming voter fraud 4 days before the election was even held, before this voter fraud supposedly happened. So that was obviously not an honest response to Election Day. Fine. There's your enterprise with a goal to steal the election. But what exactly is a pattern of racketeering activity? Well, a pattern is defined as at least 2 acts, and racketeering activity is defined in a list of 35 offences nationally, but Georgia has their own list of offences. There are 65 offences in Georgia's list, which has been defined as racketeering activity. That's part of the reason that Georgia is a bad place to engage in racketeering, Mr. President. In this indictment, Fani Willis has cited 34 different instances of racketeering activity, including impersonating a public officer, forgery and filing false documents. That's all when they were building this slate of fake electors. Influencing witnesses. That was when they were trying to intimidate Ruby Freeman, an election worker. More about that another time. Computer theft, computer trespass, computer invasion of privacy, and conspiracy to defraud the state. They were all when people were stealing data from election computers in Coffee County. We'll also talk about that another time, I'm sure. And a whole lot of false statements and writings. Yes, that is right. Get ready to hear some whingy about free speech, because in Georgia, when you lie to state officials about important or meaningful facts in matters they directly oversee, that is against the law. Freedom of speech be damned. And that charge is all over the indictment. Remember, Willis just needs to stick 2 of those 34 instances of racketeering activity to potentially build a racketeering case, which means, as John said before, minimum sentence of 5 years, although that can be discounted with probation, so don't get too excited about jail time yet. Now, I'm not going to go into much detail about the individual charges at this point, but I do want to note that the racketeering part of the indictment details 160 acts. A lot of them are not crimes. In fact, a lot of them aren't even particularly bad. For instance, Act 101 says that Trump tweeted out for people to watch the Georgia election hearings on RSB News. That is not a crime. And it leads to Trump defenders saying things like, things that are now illegal according to the Georgia indictment. Asking people for phone numbers, reserving rooms in the Capitol building, telling people to watch TV, etc., etc., etc. All very droll. But the indictment specifically labels these as overt acts in furtherance of the conspiracy, not as crimes, which is why I like this rather sarcastic response to that tweet before. So suddenly it's a crime to buy a plane ticket with 10 of your best friends on 9/11. Obviously, it's not the crime buying the ticket, it's what's leading to. Not a great point from Trump defenders there. The problem for Trump, though, is that Willis can build a racketeering case with crimes from anyone who is involved. So, for instance, Willis focuses a lot on the people who tried to manipulate and scare election worker Ruby Freeman into falsely confessing to election fraud. She also focuses a lot on the people who allegedly stole Dominion voting data from an elections office in Coffee County. And she seems to have a lot of evidence for both of those cases. But Trump didn't commit those crimes. Trump might have not even known about those crimes, yet they can still be tied to the overall conspiracy through a racketeering charge. And Willis just needs to prove 2 acts of racketeering. So that sounds like bad news for Trump. But that's only if it gets to trial. Fani Willis wants to hold the trial within the next 6 months, I believe in March next year. But legal experts are saying she's got no chance.
It seems impossible that this case could go to trial sometime next year in 2024. When you look at the fact that the other current high-profile racketeering case that is pending in the same county has been in jury selection for 8 months. This trial is 100 times as high-profile. And keep in mind also now there are many co-defendants. Each one of those co-defendants is charged with different crimes, and each one of those defendants is going to be filing motions to sever, motions to continue, motions to dismiss. All of these need to be decided. There's simply no way that this case could go to trial in the next 2 years, Hallie. I don't see it happening.
In fact, the longest trial in Georgia history is a racketeering case. It started in 2013. It's still going. And a lot can happen in 2 or 3 years while we're waiting for the trial. Even as we speak, Mark Meadows is trying to get his charges moved to federal court. If he succeeds, that could change the trial a lot. And you can bet your life that Donald Trump will be trying that same move next. And finally, should we mention that Georgia just passed a law to create a new commission that can remove wayward prosecutors? The governor said it would target far-left prosecutors who are making communities less safe. Originally, it wasn't due to take effect until 2025, but they moved it back to start this year instead. How about that one, John?
Certainly another one of those coincidences,
Yeah,
Chaz.
one of those Georgia laws I talked about. So look, this case has its strengths and its weaknesses. Nothing is going to be easy in the trials of Donald Trump.
Yeah, and don't hold your breath that anything is going to happen next year. Let's get another legal opinion on this. Joining us is Professor Fred Smith Jr., constitutional law expert, Professor of Law at Emory University in the Georgia capital, Atlanta. Professor Smith, welcome to Planet America.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Can you explain to us why it is that the District Attorney has laid, among others, this RICO charge, a racketeering charge, something that we kind of more associate with mob bosses rather than politicians?
Well, in the state of Georgia, the RICO law is quite broad, and it's broader than almost anywhere in the country. And part of what makes it so broad is that the association of individuals who come together and commit a pattern of illegal activities, their association together itself doesn't need to be illegal. So Georgia's RICO statute has been used against corrupt government officials, for example, teachers who erased and changed test scores. And so although the original idea behind RICO and racketeering statutes in the United States goes back to the mafia, the Georgia statute is much broader.
And Professor Smith, are you able to, based on this quite lengthy indictment, assess the merits of it, the strength of it as a prosecution case?
I think in some respects, yes. So what I would say is that there are a number of counts here. And it is certainly the case that RICO has taken up most of the indictment and most of the conversation. But there's a lot of other charges here that might ultimately be easier to prove. For example, false statements to government officials, right? So President Trump called the Georgia Secretary of State, and perhaps the call was most memorable because he asked the Secretary of State to find around 12,000 votes. But what the indictment alleges is that that's not the only illegal moment in that conversation. Every time President Trump made a false statement about election fraud in the state of Georgia, knowing that those statements were false, that in and of itself was illegal. And on that score, I think the charges are particularly strong.
As with Special Counsel Jack Smith's January 6th prosecution 2 weeks ago, much has been made about how much of what is in this indictment should be covered by the constitutional protection of free speech. How have the things that have been said by Trump and others become criminalised in this indictment?
Yes. So in the federal indictment, Jack Smith, who was the special prosecutor, took care to emphasize the importance of political free speech and instead focused on private activity like phone calls and the like. This indictment in some respects is different because it does, on a number of occasions, reference President Trump's public statements. What's important to note, however, is that when the indictment does that, it's not alleging that those public statements were illegal. What it's alleging is that those public statements show an overall pattern, that it shows that these individuals were acting in concert with a common goal. So the allegation is not that when Trump retweeted things or made certain statements in public that was against the law. It's simply cited in the indictment as evidence of the overall scheme.
And what do you make of these attempts already from Mark Meadows and others on that list of indictees to have this whole case transferred to the federal court system? How will that ultimately be decided?
Yes, so it is exceptionally rare for a federal court to interfere with an ongoing investigation, especially an ongoing criminal state court case. So in the early 1970s, there's a case called Younger versus Harris, where the United States Supreme Court made clear that as a general matter, federal courts may not interfere with ongoing state criminal proceedings. There are a few exceptions if one can demonstrate that the forum is particularly biased, if one can demonstrate that the prosecution is in bad faith. But those exceptions are very rarely applied. And so I wouldn't expect to see a federal court interfere here.
DA Fani Willis has already said that she would like this to go to trial within 6 months. That puts us on a tight timeline, somewhere around February of next year. But already some other RICO cases in the state of Georgia have been in the pre-trial process, jury selection, for more than 8 months. So is that a realistic timetable?
Well, it's clear that over the past few years, going back to early January 2021, she's been investigating this, as have the individuals who have been working on her behalf. And so at this point, they believe that they have at least most of the evidence that they need to go forward. That said, ultimately, it will be up to the judge in Fulton County to decide when exactly this trial goes forward. I imagine that judge is going to weigh a number of factors. He'll weigh the timeline for other criminal trials against President Trump. He may take into account the primary schedule for the Republican nomination if President Trump asks the judge to take that into account. I think that it would be relevant to weigh that, given the implications for democracy in this particular case. And so, but this is really all quite new ground.
So is it possible that the judge in this case could say, there's no way we can conduct it next year at all without it interfering with the political process? So we're going to put the whole thing off until that election is decided and come back in 2025?
Well, I suspect that is certainly what the former president is going to ask for. So typically, individuals who have been indicted are seeking a quick trial, right? In the United States, we call it a speedy trial. Individuals have a constitutional right to a speedy trial. In the federal system, there's also a congressional law that guarantees a speedy trial. And typically, defendants want to take advantage of that. Here, we're in a slightly more unusual situation where there's every reason to believe that the former president is going to seek as much delay as possible, citing the primary schedule. And each of the courts that have criminal indictments in front of them is going to have to think about that in a real way, because, again, this has direct implications for America's democracy itself.
Fred Smith, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Planet America.
Thank you.
Now, the other big bit of legal news which could impact the presidential campaign next year involves Joe Biden's son, Hunter, after a plea deal over tax and gun charges.
Well, hey, John, you forgot the sting. The sting.
That's Hunter. I didn't so much forget, but I was hoping that you would. Anyway, after that plea deal collapsed and congressional Republicans pushed ahead with their own investigations into Hunter's business dealings, the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, has announced the appointment of a special counsel to investigate the whole matter. It is David Weiss. He's the same Trump-appointed Delaware District Attorney who's been investigating Hunter Biden for the last 5 years and has now requested the additional powers of special counsel.
This appointment confirms my commitment to provide Mr. Weiss all the resources he requests. It also reaffirms that Mr. Weiss has the authority he needs to conduct a thorough investigation and to continue to take the steps he deems appropriate independently, based only on the facts and the law.
By becoming special counsel instead of a federal prosecutor, David Weiss gains greater independence, notionally, from the Justice Department and a wider brief to investigate any other possible crimes that he might unearth or that might actually occur during the course of his ongoing investigation, which could be perjury or obstruction committed by Hunter Biden or any other witnesses. And then he reports back to Merrick Garland, recommending potential charges or not. And Weiss has already indicated that those tax and gun charges, a part of that collapsed plea bargain, are now likely to go to court, Chaz.
Okay, so how have Republicans reacted to this appointment? You'll be surprised to hear they're not happy.
Really?
Senator Marsha Blackburn, for example, she says that Garland appointed Weiss special counsel because he knows Weiss will protect Hunter. which is strange because less than a year ago, a bunch of Republicans wrote to Merrick Garland asking for Weiss himself to be given the protections and authorities of a special counsel, declaring it would go a long way to restoring faith in our governmental institutions. One of those Republicans was, blow me down, Marsha Blackburn. Look, to be fair, a lot has happened since then. Weiss did sign off on Hunter's plea deal that Republicans are not exactly thrilled about, as you can see in that quote. And Weiss was also responsible for this fairly weird scenario, which I don't think anyone has explained properly yet.
That he was the one that allowed the statute of limitations to expire on some very critical felony charges that could have been brought against Hunter Biden. The prosecutor, Weiss, had been working with Hunter Biden and his attorney and actually getting waivers for those statute of limitations period, and he stopped getting the waivers. So he certainly was knowledgeable, aware that it was going to be expiring, and then something occurred where he allowed those to expire.
So that was strange, and I can understand why Republicans could have lost some faith in Weiss's work after that. There is also a technical issue with his appointment as well. That's the law specifically says that a special counsel should be selected from outside the US government. Weiss is a US attorney. He's part of the US government. But Garland has done a weird technical fix, so he's not actually breaking the law in that case. Maybe Garland was thinking that Weiss was independent enough because he was appointed by Trump and he opened the Hunter investigation under Trump. Either way, Bill Barr did do almost exactly the same thing when he appointed US Attorney John Durham to be a special counsel a few years back, and Republicans didn't seem to have a problem with that one. There is, however, something odd about this that's nagging at me. Garland said that this was why he was making Weiss a special counsel.
On Tuesday of this week, Mr. Weiss advised me that in his judgment, his investigation had reached a stage at which he should continue his work as a special counsel, and he asked to be so appointed. I have concluded that it is in the public interest to appoint him as special counsel.
Okay, so Weiss felt he needed these extra powers, but this is why Garland said he hadn't made Weiss a special counsel 2 months ago.
Mr. Weiss had, in fact, more authority than a special counsel would have. He had and has complete authority, as I said, to bring a case anywhere he wants in his discretion.
So did Weiss have these extra powers or not? There is something that doesn't add up here. Maybe this is all just politics. Maybe Garland wants to neutralise Republican claims of a double standard, where Garland targets Trump with a special counsel but spares the Bidens a special counsel, so he's evening it up. Or maybe now that they know they're definitely going to a trial with Hunter Biden, it's just easier to cut out all the other US attorneys in the picture, and then Weiss can just take care of the prosecution by himself. I don't know. But I will say this, John, to build off your point from before. As special counsel, Weiss can not only investigate further, but he can also ask for completely new jurisdictions beyond that originally specified. And he can investigate new matters that come to light in the course of his investigation. Any new matters. And what that means is if any breadcrumbs did lead to Joe Biden, which is what Republicans suggest is going to happen, Weiss, at least now, has the power to investigate them. And that's what Republicans have been calling for all along. So let's see what happens.
Yeah, indeed. It is pretty murky, and there is a lot that we don't know about this. We do know that Hunter Biden's plea deal collapsed because Biden's team thought that it was blanket immunity from future prosecutions on any of these matters, not just the tax and gun matters. So now that that is off the table, he's vulnerable to future prosecution by a hypothetical President Trump or Trump's next Attorney General. But on the other hand, by appointing the special counsel now, they might be hoping to get it out of the way. Get this investigated, get it all done and dusted, a report saying nothing to see here, no breadcrumbs to Joe Biden, and they get it out of the way before we get too deep into the election year next year. We just don't know because we don't know what is going to be there.
Totally. And by the way, as well, if let's just say they did what the Republicans said and they appointed someone else as a special counsel, you know what the Republicans would say? They'd say, oh, they're just trying to stall. They're trying to start a new investigation, which won't report for years and years and years till after the election. You're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't in this scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. It is all political. This week in the Midwestern state of Iowa, it was the centre of the American political universe. Republican candidates, including Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis, were in the capital city, Des Moines, to attend the iconic Iowa State Fair. Democrats, including Robert Kennedy Jr. and Marianne Williamson, also put in an appearance. violence. For decades, Iowa has been a very important stop on the road to the White House, but for some campaigns it's also proven to be the end of that road. This is Iowa. Human population, about 3 million. Pig population, more like 12 million. Iowa also claims to be the biggest corn producer in the world. John Wayne was born here.
But election day, Pilgrim, you can depend on it. They'll be here.
Buddy Holly died here. Iowa has also seen the births and deaths of many presidential ambitions.
It's all about the Scooby Van and one-on-one with everyday Iowans.
Iowa provides plenty of folksy backdrops for campaign events. The state is deeply embedded in America's popular culture.
Well, you got trouble, my friend.
I'm a seed of Iowa grain.
It's about as all-American a place as you can get if your idea of America is 90% white, which Iowa is, but America is not. It's more like 70%. Iowa is also more rural and more conservative than America as a whole, which is why many question its outsized political role.
Tonight, the state of Iowa has spoken.
For over half a century, the Iowa caucuses have started the process of choosing presidential candidates.
Wrapped up Iowa with 37% of the vote.
They said this day would never come.
That makes the Iowa State Fair in the summer before the caucuses a crucial proving ground.
Well, we're excited to be at the State Fair.
If you can attract a crowd in between the sideshows and keep their attention on the soapbox despite the hecklers, you just might be onto something.
It is ice cold and tasty.
And for voters and reporters alike, the State Fair lets you get up close with the candidates.
Governor DeSantis is here today too. Do you have a message for him?
I had a very small crowd.
Careful, careful, careful.
We only had a few people show up. It's a big difference.
President Trump was wrong.
Well, for more, we're joined by one of the most respected Republican political operatives in the state of Iowa, Eric Wilson, who has managed successful Iowa campaigns for the likes of Governor Mike Huckabee in 2008, as well as some less successful ones for candidates including Tim Pawlenty and Michelle Bachmann. This year, he's working for another Midwestern longshot, Governor Doug Burgum of North Dakota. Eric Wilson, great to talk to you again.
Thanks for taking the time to talk to me.
So tell us, how important has this fortnight in Iowa been with all the candidates fronting up at the State Fair? Is it a significant step on the road to next January's caucuses?
Well, it's a tremendous opportunity for them to get media attention, to also get attention from Iowans. I know some Iowans get a little frustrated with all the rigmarole and extra activities that go along with having candidates at the State Fair, the Iowa State Fair. But we were out there last week, Thursday and Friday. I was with the North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum. A lot of the people, took things in stride. They said this is just part of the Iowa State Fair. And as you know, the Republicans have typically done a straw poll in Ames in early August, just before the State Fair. And they've decided not to do this the last couple of cycles. And so that really elevates the importance of the State Fair for people to see the candidates, to get to meet them one-on-one, and to get a measure of those candidates too.
Now, Eric, every year some candidate makes a big deal about visiting all 99 counties in Iowa. This year it's Ron DeSantis. Is that the secret, or is there some other key to unlocking Iowa?
I think the success that Governor Huckabee had, for instance, in 2008, was that he understood the state. You have a rural governor campaigning in a rural state, and there is that connection there. I think that helps. I work with Governor Burgum, and he has that Midwestern sensibility. But it really is. It's a lot about putting in the work. DeSantis, I believe Governor DeSantis, his campaign said this week that he has already visited 86 counties, and frankly, that's an impressive effort. I don't expect that the former president Trump is going to do that. He has a tendency to come in, do a big rally, make a big splash, and leave. And he just has that ability to create the attention that he wants in a short amount of time, and then off he goes.
Eric, can you give us a bit of an insight into your strategy for the Doug Burgum presidential campaign there in Iowa? Is a lot of retail politicking, obviously, at the moment, but ultimately, do you have to get into at least third, maybe even springboard into second place at the caucuses to have a campaign that is viable beyond there?
Yeah, I think ideally that's the strategy. Former Iowa Democratic chair, a fellow named Dave Nagel, who was a congressman for a while, had a saying that it's organize, 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 get hot at the end. And that's really what you have to do. A lot of times you feel like you're toiling in obscurity for quite a while. And with Governor Huckabee, it was that way for quite a while. I think as I look at this caucus and the strategy for Governor Burgum, for instance, I look back to the 1984 Democratic race where Walter Mondale was our sitting vice president. And he was an overwhelming favorite to not only win the Iowa caucuses, but to win the nomination. Mondale ended up winning on caucus night with 48.6% of the vote. Second place was Colorado Senator Gary Hart, who came in with 16%. And all the stories were about Gary Hart. That it wasn't news that Mondale won. It was news that Hart finished second. And so it was, here's a new challenger that's emerged. So whoever comes up with that surprise on caucus night here for the Republicans on January 15th of next year, they're the person that's going to be the story.
Now, we've seen before how candidates can have a surprise win in Iowa and gain some momentum, like Ted Cruz in 2016, but Donald Trump still won the primary, didn't he? Is there any realistic chance that you can see anyone who isn't Donald Trump actually winning the entire primary race from here?
He is the odds-on favorite. You make a great point that he is the favorite, and to be the man, you've got to beat the man. And so somebody is going to have to step forward and show that they either have the organizational strength or the charisma or some other tangible advantage to upset the former president. He has a strong hold. He has a strong base, but there's been that recognition too that he has a floor of support, but that he also has a ceiling of support. There are a number of Republicans that say they're willing to look at other candidates. So it's the job of all the campaign managers who don't work for Donald Trump to motivate voters that support our candidates and then to get them to turn out. January 15th is likely to be a pretty cold evening here in Iowa. So cold and snowy. And so it's going to be our job to make sure that we get those people out for our candidates.
Eric Wilson, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
It's time we had a fireside chat. And Florida's Governor Ron DeSantis was among those presidential candidates at the Iowa State Fair this week. He decided not to appear on the traditional Des Moines Register soapbox to give a speech, but he did take part in a so-called fair-side chat with Iowa's Republican Governor Kim Reynolds. But sadly for Ron, it didn't go that well. First, the whole event was buzzed by Donald Trump's private plane going over the fairground, and then Trump supporters heckled and whistled and rang cowbells to try and drown Ron DeSantis out. Well, that unholy racket clearly annoyed Governor Reynolds, at least.
Hey, you know what? We're in Iowa, and in Iowa, we're Iowa nice. So let's give everybody the opportunity to hear our candidates. So we'll stop until you do, but we're all going to have an opportunity to hear from each and every candidate. That's what we've been doing. So, okay.
Well, in the end, they weren't Iowa nice. They didn't wait for them to stop. Security came in and dragged the Trump supporters away. But DeSantis, you have to say, Chaz, at this stage, he's kind of putting all his chips on Iowa. He really needs to do very well there next January if he's going to have any chance of knocking off Donald Trump.
No, there's no doubt about that. I mean, did you see the hats as well that Trump's people handed out to the crowd in that scenario?
No.
Trump, back-to-back Iowa champ, 2016-2020. Now, in 2016, Ted Cruz won the Iowa caucuses, of course.
Yeah.
In 2020, Trump was up against someone who was so obscure, I bet not a single one of you at home could name him. Can you?
Friend of the show, Bill Weld, former governor of Massachusetts, no less.
Swish. Anyway, I don't even think Bill remembers that he was there in Iowa. Anyway, it's both hilarious and depressing just how prepared Trump supporters are to enable his refusal to accept defeat by wearing that cap. But back to DeSantis, like you were saying. He really has been focusing on Iowa for weeks. He's almost been ignoring New Hampshire because he's been just Iowa, right? He's been going to every county, the whole 99 counties.
And that thing, by the way, I mean, that's now become a rite of passage. Back in 1975, famously, Jimmy Carter, when he was the governor of Georgia, he rode a bicycle across all 99 counties of Iowa, and he ended up effectively winning the Iowa caucuses the next year. Uncommitted was first, Jimmy Carter was second, but ever since then, you're right, going to 99 counties has been, if you want to win the state, that's what you've got to do.
And also get great quads.
Yeah, sure,
that's
you
what
would.
you do. But yeah, anyway, so that's what DeSantis has been doing. He's been trudging around, he's been putting on his best impression of an action hero.
They're trying to break into our country. If they're trying to smuggle in product that's going to kill Americans, that's going to be the last thing they ever do because those cartel members are going to end up stone cold dead. We are going to hold them accountable.
Stone cold dead. Was there a little vest with his name on it? Well, I got to say, when he's trying to do the Trump tough guy act, the Schwarzenegger film that he most reminds me of is actually Twins. Not sure the Republican faithful are totally convinced by that. Although Iowa is as good a place as any for DeSantis to make a stand because they really haven't taken to Trump as much as other states have. If you look at the polls, national polls, Trump's ahead of DeSantis by 54-17, then Tim Scott's next on 3. But in Iowa, it's 44-20, and then Tim Scott is on 9. So that's a 24-point margin to Trump in Iowa instead of a 37-point margin to Trump nationally. So it's as good a place as any for DeSantis to make his stand. First up, do you think there is a legitimate shot of an upset there? And if so, do you think it matters?
Well, it does matter. It matters who comes second to Donald Trump in Iowa if he's going to win the state. Yep. But Iowa, as we know, has always had this soft spot, whether it's for Mike Huckabee or Santorum or Ted Cruz. Often, if you can appeal to the evangelical Christian base and the rural voters, you can put together enough of a vote, maybe 35% of the vote in Iowa, to win the caucuses. They're a funny system of election. If Trump gets knocked off in Iowa, then whoever does that knocking off, whether it's Ron DeSantis or Tim Scott is the kind of candidate who could very well appeal to the voters in Iowa. He's kind of a Republican version of Barack Obama, and it was Iowa that sent Barack Obama on his merry way to the White House in 2008. So, if one of those candidates can upset Trump, come better than, come a close second, that's what George McGovern did in 1972. He didn't win, but he was the surprise story in it. So, look, there is a scenario that I can see, but so far, nobody has ever had numbers like Donald Trump has got in the state of Iowa.
The other thing I would add is just looking in history, there's lots of instances of a candidate doing really well in Iowa and then sucking in New Hampshire. Yeah. And if they do, they become an also-ran. Klobuchar is a great example. She was a complete also-ran by the time New Hampshire came along, even though she did really well in Iowa with the Democrats. Buttigieg, by contrast, did well in Iowa and then did pretty well in New Hampshire as well. And so he became a real thing until he dropped out much, much later on in the contest.
Yeah, and remember as well, Ted Cruz was last man standing against Trump, Mike Huckabee, Rick Santorum against Mitt Romney. Coming second in Iowa, it doesn't necessarily make you the Republican nominee, but it makes you the alternative. It makes you, it's going to be a two-horse race, you're the other horse.
Sure, but my point is they need to back it up in New Hampshire. Yeah. DeSantis probably can. But maybe Tim Scott, for instance, if he has a surprise result in Iowa, might not be able to back it up in New Hampshire.
Yeah, but then he goes to South Carolina and maybe he has a big win there. We will see in January, February next year. We are now approaching the second anniversary of that chaotic final withdrawal of American forces from Afghanistan, marking the end, of course, of their 2-decade operation there, and clearing the way, of course, for the return of the Taliban. Well, thousands of Afghans who worked with US forces, including people like translators, were evacuated in those final days and weeks, but tens, even hundreds of thousands more were left behind, either in third countries or in Afghanistan itself. And in some cases, they are now in considerable danger of jail or even death because they cooperated with the United States. And 2 years on, there's been a painfully slow and complicated approach to the visas to allow those people to come to the United States. Congress as well has been sitting on its hands in all of this. And as it is now, we've got people whose lives are at risk. We don't know how many have paid with their life.
Yeah, look, I'll talk about the legislation in a second, but the Afghans that you say, they were promised that no helpers would be left behind 2 years ago. And it's true, 78,000 of them were brought over. They were given parole for 2 years. That parole's just been extended for another 2 years in America. But even now, 2 years later, bear in mind 78,000 got parole. You would not believe how many Afghans who qualified for American assistance in getting out of Afghanistan are still trapped over there.
Afghan Special Immigrant Visa Program, for which the Department of State is primarily responsible, still has more than 152,000 SIV applicants in Afghanistan undergoing processing as of last month.
150,000 of them, and every one of them qualifies for the visa program because they are potentially marked for death by the Taliban. Still, 2 years later, but not still being processed. That doesn't even count the tens of thousands of people who didn't qualify for the program but would also still be marked for death. Like, for instance, some of the female troops of the old regime, the old prosecutors who punished Taliban members, for example. Believe it or not, as of earlier this year, there were still 200 people who had actually obtained special immigrant visas but still hadn't been flown back to America. So they've really messed this up. Then there are the 78,000 who are lucky enough to get to America and are currently on temporary parole. These people should get permanent asylum because there's no way Afghanistan is ever going to be safe for them. Yet out of those 78,000 Afghan immigrants to America, right now only 2,000 of them have actually received asylum. 5,600 have been approved for permanent residency, leaving 70,000 of them in limbo. They're not exactly being processed at breakneck speed. So you talk about legislation. There's a piece of legislation called the Afghan Adjustment Act, which has just been sitting in the Senate for, well, when we left 9 months ago, we were talking about then, and it's still just sitting there. What that would do is, I've got some notes here, it would expand the eligibility for visas to some of those other groups I said who aren't covered by it, like the former Afghan government officials, aid workers, activists, journalists. There's a heap of them. It would create a task force to help Afghans who qualify for the visas to get them, so under 150,000 people just sitting there forever. It would also help get P2 visas processed, which is a different kind of visa. That's the visa for Afghan women who are generally in danger in Afghanistan. And at the moment, for them to get that visa, they need to be referred to directly by an American citizen. They need to go to a different country to get the visa, as if a woman in Afghanistan can escape and get to another country. It's like Maria von Trapp stuff. It's not going to happen, right? So this Afghan Adjustment Act would help that process as well. And the 78,000, it would help them get permanent residency. So it's a good act. It's just sitting there mainly because some people don't want the Afghans to get permanent residency because of immigration things and threats of terrorism, as if these people are terrorists.
And politically, it's a reminder of the Biden administration's perceived failures in the hasty withdrawal and the fact that a lot of these people should have had their visas processed long before that withdrawal happened, because it's very hard to process visa applications when people are in a hostile country such as Afghanistan with no diplomatic relationship.
Totally.
And the entire system is broken in the United States now. If you just want to get a new passport, you're waiting 3, 4, 5 months because of the Trump-era cuts to State Department staff who process those. And that's just a passport with American ID. Imagine trying to get from Kabul into the United States.
The average asylum queue right now is 314 days. I just checked that. Although, admittedly, that's shorter than 600 days, which is what it was a few years back.
OK, well, that is it for another trip to Planet America. Next week, a full wrap-up of the first Republican candidate debate in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It looks as though it's going to be all about Trump, even though he's not going to be there.
That's right, and a big one for Ron DeSantis. We'll talk more about this next week, but Ron DeSantis is looking a lot like Scott Walker at the moment. He's funny, who a lot of people at home might not even heard
Pile
of.
on Ron! Pile on Ron!
And they're going after him, so he's going to need to perform well in this debate. You can catch Planet America whenever you like on ABC, iView, YouTube or Facebook. And don't forget the PEP podcast, by the way, right there. If you want way more detail about the Georgia indictment, believe me, I have it. That is where you'll find it. See you there.
Good night.